Welcome back. The National Shelter Movement of South Africa has called for a 3-year gender-based violence shelter funding national model. This is to integrate the work of civil society, private sector and government on gender-based violence and femicide. Joining us is Dr. Zubeda Dangor, who is the executive head at the National Shelter Movement of South Africa. Dr. Dangor, thank you for making time this afternoon. Was there any commitment made from government at this summit to fund the gender-based violence shelters?
Good afternoon, Clement, and good afternoon to your listeners. Thank you for the opportunity. So I think government realizes the need for adequate funding. There hasn't been a definite commitment, but what we have realized that in the first quarter of this year, there's been a 52% increase in the murder of women and 46% increase in the number of children that have been murdered in South Africa. Now, shelters play a fundamental role in providing safety for women and children. So in other words, shelters can prevent femicide, which is what this Indaba was actually looking at as well. However, it appears that from a funding point of view, we only have mostly government and overseas international donors, but we don't really have enough support from the private sector and big business in South Africa. So what's clearly come up in the second presidential summit is that government has to liaise with the private sector in a major way to be able to ensure that these services are actually provided. So the shelters are probably very important, but so are the GBV services that are offered aside from shelters in this country if we are to make a dent. The president himself has said that we are a country at war with ourselves. Now, if the president can acknowledge this, what do we on the ground, what are we seeing? We're seeing horrific lives being lost of women and children on a day-to-day basis. Every day, it's one more life. Every day, it's one more story. And we cannot go on like this as a country.
No, absolutely. We can't. And you've explained how important these shelters are for the victims of gender-based violence. And the thing is, when the shelters for abused women are dilapidating, right? They are underfunded. And they have been proven to work over and over again, as you have demonstrated. But when they are underfunded, Dr. Dangor, and there's inadequate response from the SAPS, how exposed are the victims? So from the work that you do, what are you seeing on the ground when these shelters are not funded properly?
So the difficulty is that most of the NGO shelters in South Africa are funded partially by government. Okay? So what does this mean? And usually this funding is about 39%. So the rest of the funding has to be, the shelter itself has to raise the funds. Now, given the pandemic that we've just had on COVID, it was really difficult for shelters to actually raise those funds. And this means that different shelters offer different levels of services because they don't have the correct funding. And now, in complete opposition to that, the few government shelters that exist are fully funded, and they don't experience the same difficulty. But this also presents another problem for us. So does it mean that women that go to the government shelters require better services or get better services than those in the NGO shelters? And of course, constitutionally, this isn't okay.
Yeah. And how much work is government doing in ensuring that it's not only, as you say, fully funding these government shelters, but they are providing some funding for the NGOs? And if they are providing that funding, how much is it? Because you've mentioned the NGOs often also have to look for donations and some funds in order to run these organizations.
Most of the shelters want to run excellent services, but they're hampered by the lack of resources. So currently, most shelters in the NGO sector receive about 39% of their funding from government. The rest, they have to find themselves. So you walk a tight line in terms of, on the one hand, providing a service, on the second hand, trying to raise funds all the time, given, all the requirements for sheltering. Sheltering is not an easy process. The people who work there are absolutely committed. And what we find is that the social workers and some of the staff who work at shelters are not remunerated in the same way that government social workers are who work at government shelters. And I think that this is completely incorrect.
There's an opportunity here, Doctor, for society, the private sector, and even government to work together in a multisectoral approach. Is there appetite to come together and see this through?
This was something that came up very strongly at the second presidential summit 2 days ago, that, this is an absolute need. At this point in time, it's not an issue of appetite. It's an issue of commitment. All of these sectors and society as a whole need to make the commitment to stop the scourge of gender-based violence in South Africa. And they have to be really serious, and there's a huge urgency around this matter.
Mm-hmm. You have tried to have conversations with President Cyril Ramaphosa about this very issue. I know you've previously penned an open letter to him. Did that come to anything?
Unfortunately not. We did write to the president during COVID, where some shelters in particular provinces were not receiving their funding on time. And of course, we were during COVID. The problem was that they couldn't feed the women and children, and salaries couldn't be paid. And this is when we actually wrote to the president. Unfortunately, didn't receive a letter or a response at that time. The second time we did write to the president was when Minister Becky Cele, after the Krugersdorp rapes, indicated that to one of the survivors that if you raped once, you should count yourself lucky. Now, for somebody at that level to be sending this kind of message to the society that we live in is absolutely incomprehensible. What are we saying? It almost suggests that people at the top levels need to be educated first.
Yeah, and I know that in the past, the minister has indicated that he feels he was sort of misquoted on that particular point. But is that the reason why you then called on him to be removed?
Absolutely. I mean, we're fighting gender-based violence at so many faceted levels, and we cannot have somebody in positions of leadership and power who send out these messages, because it undoes the work that organizations on gender-based violence are trying to do. We're trying to say to communities, we're trying to say to men, it's really, really important that you respect your women. But if the minister can come out and say this, what do we expect from people on the ground?
Did you take part?
And you're right. He did say that he was misquoted. I don't think he was misquoted. We were very clear about this. And these are issues that we can't take lightly.
Yeah, and then I think sensitivity, you're right, Dr. Dangor, is very important when you are addressing issues such as these. Did you take part in the gender-based violence summit? So, I'm asking this because I imagine that was an opportunity for various organizations to raise their concerns, their challenges, and where they want government to intervene and what they want government to prioritize.
Absolutely. We were very much a part of the summit, and in fact facilitated one of the action caucuses for gender-based violence service providers. And the message is loud and clear and is the same over the years. Funding is an absolute priority, and it has come through in this summit once again. And besides the funding, which is a major issue, the other issue that has come up very strongly is that after the first summit, there was a gender-based violence and femicide council that was to be set up. And this is very slow to take place. It hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
And the minister has promised that the Minister of Social Development has promised at the summit that it would take 3 months. But given where the bill is at the moment, it really doesn't look like it can go out for public participation in the next 2 or 3 months. And this is what civil society is calling for, that this council will be there to regulate the affairs of NGOs and issues around gender-based violence. So it is of critical importance that this happens as a matter of urgency.
Yeah.
I think the other big finding from the summit is that big business and government have to really come together to ensure that NGOs, shelters, and people working on the ground are really offered the assistance they need, because I promise you, on the ground, people are working themselves to a hilt. They work very, very hard to try and ensure that, you know, we deal with the scourge of gender-based violence.
Yeah, I've got a statement here that the National Shelter Movement released on the 21st of October, and you say, and I quote here, we need anger, because without it we are saying that gender-based violence and femicides are okay. Do you think we've demonstrated that we are fed up? 'Cause the anger that's really needed? And when are we going to reach that point where we say enough is enough? I mean, when you look at other countries, they have taken to the streets. They have demonstrated collective anger and frustration over issues like gender-based violence. And I'm just wondering, as South Africa, at what point are we collectively, as society, as government, as business, when are we going to say, that's it?
So we are working collectively. But the point is, we're not being heard to a point where commitments are actually being made. I mean, the fact that there was a first summit happened because there was a collective grouping that came together to actually say to the president, we need you to assist us. They didn't leave the union buildings until the president came to receive the memorandum. And so this is where the whole issue of the recognition of gender-based violence began, at that level. But I'm afraid that if you look at our ministers, there's not a level of urgency. Even at the level of government, people are not working together. The lead department for gender-based violence is the social development. But the other departments are often missing from these dialogues. For example, the Department of Health is often absent. SAPS is not always present. This is not an issue that one department or civil society can deal with on our own. We need to come together. And I think as long as all of these other groupings in society realize the urgency and the need to save lives of women and children in this country, we're not going to move very far. But you're right. Maybe we need to take to the streets all over again.
Yeah, countries like India have done it before, and they sent a very strong message to those that are in power. Dr. Zubeda Dangor, thank you for making time for us this afternoon.